Hi, welcome to the Plant Network. We're a community of nearly 800 learners who long to see vibrant communities of Jesus followers among the least reached. And today I'm going to interview David Broodryk, who's going to talk to us about disciple-making movements in an urban context. I think you'll find it really interesting. Well, David, it's nice to have you here and speak to us in the Plant Network. David Broodryk has been working with discipleship movements around the world. But our topic for today is to talk about discipleship movements, particularly around urban contexts, and maybe helping us contrast with how they seem to be different than in a rural context. But David, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Scott. Really great to be with you.
So tell me a little bit about yourself.
I live in Midrand in South Africa. So many of your listeners will probably be familiar with Johannesburg and Pretoria, two big cities. So right in the middle of them, they've actually merged together. And right where they join is an area called Midrand. And that's where I live. So I am surrounded by about 15, I think it's going on 16 million people in basically two cities that have merged. And we're right in the center of that sort of high density area in South Africa. And I'm married, 27 years. I've got two children, adult children. My daughter is a teacher, a primary school teacher, and my son is studying his final year next year of mechanical engineering. So that is me.
Oh, great. Well, one of the things that we've been tracking and trying to get a better grip around is we have a lot of case studies on how discipleship movements are breaking out across the world, and particularly in rural areas. One of the things that I heard you speak on in another webinar was about the differences between maybe the methodologies that are used, the DMM methodologies used in a rural area versus those that need to be tweaked or adjusted in an urban context. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, so our journey goes back 30 years. I've been involved in ministry. I keep saying 30 years, and year after year I say the same thing. So maybe I must recalculate that. Maybe it's changed a bit. But it's about 30 years my wife and I have been together in ministry. And in that time, I've been in and out of business and much of the time in pastoral ministry. And then probably the last 15 years been really focused on mission movements. And we really came to this area, and our heart was to see a multiplying movement. And this is now 20 years ago. And we kind of basically started a traditional church in the end for many reasons. You know, we weren't funded, we weren't supported, we needed support. It's the best way to sort of, stay in ministry and still grow support. And so we started this traditional church, and after a few years, I just felt the scratching in me, and I realized this isn't what God has called us to. Nothing wrong with it, all good, but what is better is doing what God has specifically called you to do. And so I remember the one day I was talking to this group of people. We were in a school hall, still new church, about 100 people. And as I was talking to them, my mind started to drift. And it was like I went up into the sky, and I went higher and higher and higher, looked down. At that stage was kind of a province, high density province, which is two cities joined together. And I was surrounded by 15 million people. And as I looked down on the city, I asked myself a question that really changed my life. I asked, what would it take to reach the city? And I realized in that moment, now I'm having this whole encounter with this vision while I'm busy talking to people, preaching. And in my mind, I'm going, what would it take to really reach a city? And I just kind of realized that what I was pursuing would never get there. I could be wildly successful and build a really big and successful church. And, the largest churches in our city are claiming at that stage like 30,000 people, one or two of them. But I couldn't impact 10 million people. And this started to bug me. And that question grew and grew. What would it really take to take the Great Commission seriously, to not sort of just be doing our little thing and, you know, be happy with a little thing, but to take the Great Commission seriously. And it set me on a journey. And so I really got more seriously involved in movements. I transitioned out of that church, and we began to build disciple-making movements. And it's a long story. David Watson, who at that stage was completely unknown, came and did a training in our city, and somebody asked me to host him, and I kind of reluctantly said yes. And we had him in our house, not knowing who it was, and I took him to his training sessions every day, let him do his training. I left, and then I went back again and sort of brought him home. And every evening, we would sort of bath or shower, sit in our pajamas in front of our laptops in the lounge, and I began to ask him questions. And it was life transforming, because it was the first time in my life I actually met someone that believed that we could see multiplying movements of the gospel actually take entire regions. And so he went into a 10-year mentoring relationship with me, and we began to see these movements happen around Southern Africa. It jumped country to country to country, and we got to about 3,500 groups and churches that had just multiplied and exploded. And the Lord began to take me internationally, and we saw the same thing happen in different countries of the world. And that's a whole different story that's too long to tell here. But about 10 years ago, something began to scratch in me. And it was this topic that we're talking about right now. We had seen these movements happen in different regions of the world, ones that I can't even mention on this call. But we'd seen these amazing things happen, and thousands, literally thousands. I was speaking to one leader the other day from, you know, one of the big regions, and he said to me, there's now 12,000 churches. And so we'd seen these explosive movements, but something began to scratch in me, and I just kind of shaped that way. I want to see that, what's the next thing? What's the next thing God wants us to do? And so I was praying about that, and my wife and I were ready to pack our bags, move to some country, and just start afresh. And I came across a graph on Wikipedia that really kept me awake for several nights. And it was a graph that showed global urbanization. And if you type in urbanization on Wikipedia, you'll probably hit the same graph. And it kind of looks like this. And, you know, on one side, it showed the number of people in cities growing and the number of people in rural areas diminishing. And 2007 is where we crossed that threshold, and we'll never go back. And it's kind of looked forward, and I looked at the year 2050, the world will be 70% urban. And I said, well, okay, I'll still be alive, hopefully, in 2050. So this is in my lifetime that we're talking about, that the world is going to go to 70% urban. How are we doing in cities? Because this is really important. So I got on the phone and I started calling people. The internet wasn't even that strong at that time. And I started getting hold of people, and I realized something after a little bit of research. We were not seeing these multiplying movements in urban environments. In fact, every time we hit a city, people would talk to me about massive breakdown of replication and multiplication and movement. And so I began to put my mind to it. And slowly, over the last 10 years, the Lord has moved me closer and closer to that being just one of our primary focuses, is what will it take to see rapid multiplying movements of the gospel in the cities of the world? Because if we don't, then in my lifetime, everything that we do, all our energy, all our effort will be relevant to 30% of the world's population. That's the ceiling. We won't be able to get to more than 30% of the world's population. Now, that was a United Nations graph. The European Commission did another study, and the UN graph is more about, you know, government and how governments define cities. But the European Commission graph, they actually put drones in the air, looked at satellite images, and they weren't so concerned about what a government defines as a city. They said, where are these high density environments? And they came back and they said the world's already 83% urban. So we know that the world is somewhere between 50 and 80% urban right now. And we also know with a relatively high degree over the 10 years now of me just searching, unless there's something out there that I haven't found, that as a whole, we aren't seeing massive, rapid multiplication of the gospel in urban environments. We're seeing it in rural environments. And that to me is a crisis. That means that the urban dweller could be the biggest unreached people group that we face in the world today. And so 10 years ago, no one was really talking about this. We began to talk about it. We began to run meetings and try and solve this problem. We pulled together people in different parts of the world. I think we did one in the Russian-speaking world, one in the UK, one in Europe, one in Africa, one in North America. And I pulled together guys that were building movements, and we pulled together some urban experts that had no idea what a movement was, but they were, they understood urbanization. So we put them in the room, closed the door, and said, well, for 5 days, we're going to figure out, number one, what's the problem? Number two, can we find a solution? And for about 2 or 3 years, I went around just doing that. And we began to see some common challenges emerge, but no solutions. So it's been since then that we've been really working at raising up teams, finding solutions to that, and we're beginning to see some serious breakthroughs. But the number one challenge to cities is complexity. And so this is not just a simple plug and play solution that we can say, I have the answer, let's plug it in there and we're going to reach our city. It's not as simple as that. It is a journey. And so we've been on that journey for 10 years.
Something that you said really struck me in another meeting. You said that we have to see cities differently in their complexity. I think you said we can't see a city as a mega village. Could you tell us more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, a rural environment is held together socially. So the huge challenges are social. They're partly structural, they're partly institutional, but they're also social structures that change from rural to urban environments. And where I learned this was I was sitting in Madagascar, in Tana, one of the main cities, and we were training a church planting team, but the team was not working in the city. The team was working on the East Coast in the rainforests, and we'd seen thousands and thousands of churches start. And so I was training this team and working with them, and I was sitting there with one young man, actually not that young, I think he was older than me, but they all look young there, I don't know why. They got some secret juice or something. So he was sitting there, and this man had seen, I think, if I can remember correctly, a couple of 100 churches start in the rainforests. They literally send a team through, the jungles and on canoes and to the next village and the next village. And they've seen all these churches start. But he was also working in a very high density environment around a lake. And so I thought this was a great opportunity to talk to him about the differences between rural and urban. And what's interesting here is we weren't talking about westernization so much, because even that high density area wasn't highly Western, it was just high density. And so I said to him, tell me about the differences. And so everywhere in Africa, when you ask a question, they tell you a story. And so he said, let me tell you a story. We took our most successful church planters from the rural environments, and they started to walk. We sent them to the city, and they started to walk. And as they walked, they went through one village after the other, and the village would invite them in, they'd feed them, they'd sleep there, and they'd carry on walking. And they would greet people on the road, talk to people. They got about halfway to the city, and they discovered no one was greeting them anymore. No one was talking to them. They would walk past each other on the road, but people wouldn't talk to them, wouldn't greet them. Now, we all know that intuitively. You go to a village, people talk to each other on the streets, they even greet strangers. You get to a city, they don't. But this was the experience. But this is what he said that really, really made me think. He said, as our church planters reached the city, they no longer greeted anyone else. So in one walk from the, they walked and caught buses and walked and did different forms of transport, but in one journey from the village to the city had actually changed them. So the city, high density environments create a certain kind of culture, an urban culture, that forces people to come to the city to conform to their culture. Now, why is that important? Well, that particular point is very important because movements of the gospel are predicated on the fact that we have natural social networks in place. So the idea behind the gospel moving is the idea that there are natural social networks. People know people who know people who know people, and that the gospel can move through those natural relationships. Well, if fundamentally those relationships go away or they change, then that has a huge impact on how we build movements of the gospel. And that's just kind of one example of some of those changes that happen from rural to urban. Now, as we've researched this both practically on the ground with leaders, experimented, but also read up and researched on it, and we've got some people that really understand this talking to us, we've realized it's much more complex than that simple story. There are all kinds of complexities to cities that we have to understand if we want to see movements in the city. Now, again, if the goal is, there's nothing wrong with it, but if the goal is to plant an attractional church, say this is church, have a location, have everyone come to the location and just try and grow that, that's fine. But if your goal is, if your stated goal is, and my particular calling is as a strategist, so if your particular call is, I want to see the city reached, then you've got to have a strategy to reach the city. And so I go to church after church after church in urban environments. People say to me, you've got to come to this church. They're going to reach the city. And I go to the church and they're singing all the songs. We're going to reach the city. We're going to reach the city. The sermon is, we're going to reach the city. And then I go to lunch with the pastor and I say, that's fantastic. Your vision is incredible. What's your strategy? And he goes, I don't know. And I say, well, how are you going to reach the city? How many people in the city? Well, 10 million, 8 million, 5 million. So your strategy at the moment is to bring 5 million people into your building? Is that the strategy to reach the church? And are you assuming that those 5 million people are all going to love your preaching? They're all going to love your style of music? They're all going to like the way that you do things? That's a huge assumption. And actually what it is, it's a lack of strategy. And so we work with a lot of churches to help them find strategies to match their vision, because the city is complex. And one of the first things you've got to realize is natural social networks look very different from rural to urban environments. And I would say, and this is just one of those wild statistics that people throw out there because there's nothing to back it, but I would say that 99% of our strategies today, our church growth strategies, are still rural. We're taking rural strategies and we've planted them in the city and we've dressed them up and we've given them some good music and we've kind of put some paint on it, but it's fundamentally a strategy that's not an urban strategy. And so I just believe that we need to become serious. If we really want to reach cities, we need to become serious about adding a strategy that will actually work to reaching those cities.
Thank you. And one of the things that I found quite interesting is explaining the meaning, or maybe another angle of the meaning of ethne in the Great Commission: go and make disciples of all ethne. And how might the ethne look in the city as composed to another way of seeing it?
Yeah, a couple of hundred years ago, the body of Christ thought ethne was a nation state. South Africa, Sweden, UK, Germany. It was a nation state. And so when it says go and make disciples of all nations, we thought, okay, go and disciple these nation states. It's not a bad conclusion, but it is an interpretation of something that's not the fundamental meaning of the word ethne. And so over years, we became more wise and we said, well, actually, the way people group together, the way people actually associate with one another is a lot more about linguistic, ethnic divide. And so a whole people group strategy began to emerge. And we have some incredible organizations today that have lists of people groups, and we target the unreached people groups, and we say, these are the groups that we have to reach. And that is fantastic. It's incredible. And we've done so well with that. However, it is still largely a rural understanding of how people associate. And it is an interpretation of the word ethne. It's not necessarily the inherent meaning. So what is the inherent meaning of the word ethne? Well, you just basically have to Google it, and you'll see that fundamentally the word ethne refers to how large groups of people move together. It can be referred to, an ethne of a large group of animals, a swarm of bees, for example, a herd of cattle, how large groups move together. And so if the way that people associate is shifting, then our interpretation of ethne needs to either shift or become more complex than it currently is. And I think that there is a shift around urbanization that is taking place. And here's what it is. In rural environments, people basically associate with one another around common language. So you go to a village, everyone basically speaks the same language. Common ethnicity, common bloodline, sometimes they're all related. And I've been to villages and, there's maybe 3 people that aren't family, and, the other couple of 100 people are all family. And so these are the things, and then common geography. And so my friends, the people I live with, associate with, eat with, they're my neighbors. They're the people very close to me. And so that is how ethne kind of works in a rural environment. When you study the history of urbanization, through our history, people move to cities primarily for economic reasons. So there's lots of reasons people move to cities, but one of the primary reasons is economics. And the people that move are young. And so urbanization has largely caused a population of people that is much younger than rural environments. And what happens is the young person goes, there's no job opportunities, there's no opportunity to study, I want those things. And so that young person moves to the city, and they leave behind their common ethnicity, their common language, all of those things that held them together. They move to the city. So what happens when this young person moves to the city? The first thing he finds is that the city is not a whole bunch of people that speak the same language. They're not a whole bunch of people that are related to each other. They're also not the same ethnicity. He finds that they come from everywhere. So we see this whole melting pot of cultures and languages and people in the city. So the first thing that happens is that person begins to be isolated because they don't know how to relate. And so social isolation takes place. And loneliness is one of the fundamental problems in cities and a large cause of suicide. So you get a lot of lonely people in cities. But God had created us for community. He created us to move together. He created us to kind of ethne together. And so in the city, people reform communities. They reform the way that they group. But here's the key. They do not reform around those traditional things. So they don't necessarily, and here's where I'm going to speak half-truths, because sometimes they do. Sometimes people of the same ethnicity go to one part of the city and they kind of group like that. But then sometimes their children are integrating with the city, and all of these other things happen. So complexity is the core fundamental challenge in cities. But overridingly, when people reform community, they don't do it around common geography, common ethnicity, common language, common bloodline. So how do they reform community? And we call that affinity. So they find an affinity with one another. And that affinity is usually around common interest, common need, or common cause. So they like the same things. And so you'll find people with 5 ethnicities coming together because they like the same food, they're interested in the same sport, there's a common interest, there's a common need, they have the same problem. And so I live in a violent country, South Africa. I think the world knows that. And so people form community here because they are fighting crime. They'll come together against crime. There's a common need or a common problem, or there's a common cause. They're fighting for something, whether it's save the whales or change the world, or some political thing that causes swarming in urban environments. So what causes the reformation of ethne in the urban environments and how it's built is very different to the rural environments. And so if you go to the urban environment and you try to plant a church around the same fundamental principles as the village, you're going to have a really, really hard time. But if you understand this, then strategically you can start to figure out how do people swarm, how do people herd, how do people move together. And that means that you can have a strategy of evangelism that reaches groups of people, not just individuals.
And how does that's very interesting. And how does that relate to, let's say, urban spaces, which I heard you distinguish between like affinity versus actual like spaces where they form?
So yeah, once you understand, let's say people group together who are young 20, 30 somethings, and they group together around a certain kind of music, and you can find them swarming or herding around that. Then you start asking yourself, what are the spaces that they occupy? Because that's where I'm going to find them. And so there are multiple urban spaces that we have to understand that we find people in. The big challenge right now that we face in the church, and I think the coronavirus has exposed it, but it hasn't caused the challenge. The challenge is at least 20 years old. And the challenge is still a massive sacred secular divide. And so what we do is we constantly, because religion is bound up in the heart of man, we constantly try to create holy spaces that are separate from the world. And we want to meet there and gather there, and then we get comfortable there, and then we have a strategy that says to the world, come to my holy space. Where Jesus said, you need to make yourself uncomfortable and go to them. We go, no, they can be uncomfortable and come to our environment. Bad growth strategy. And so there's a sacred secular divide. So we need to move out of these holy spaces that I don't think is the strategy for reaching cities, is to just build more holy spaces, into these unholy spaces, these secular spaces. And what are they? I call them urban spaces. And so these spaces are where people live. And so if you begin to say, what would it look like for the kingdom of God to move into the homes where people live? So there are pros and cons to where people live. Increasingly in urban environments, people see the home as a very private space. Increasingly, as rentals go up and the cost of living goes up, homes are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But it's one of the spaces that I believe that we should see the fullness of the kingdom, including the fullness of church, be present inside the home. And there, of course, are house church and home church movements out there. I don't believe that could be our only strategy. So for the reasons I've mentioned, homes are increasingly private spaces where I don't meet new people in my home. I meet them in a public place. And so the home space, the workspace, people are spending large amounts of their time, probably the majority of their time, in the workplace, because urban areas were built, cities were built for economic reasons. So the economics is what drives a city. Relationships are what drive a village. Economics is what drives a city. You have to understand that. So people spend a lot of time in the workplace. Workplace is a great place to actually plant church, make disciples, help people find Jesus, transform lives, and plant church. But there's of course there's some challenges around that. Very, very secular workspaces may not allow you to do that. So there are obviously some challenges around that. So where do we go? We go to what, and this is in our language, this is broadly out there, third spaces. So third spaces are where people are not at work and they're not at home. So where are they when they're not at work and they're not at home? They're in the pub, they're in a bar, they're in a golf course, they're walking, running, jogging. All these spaces, often around hobbies, interests, and these are great spaces to plant churches because people's guard is down. This is where they build friendships and where there's a lot more trust. In the workspace, there's not a lot of trust. So there's a lot of trust. These are great places to plant churches. And so we need to ask ourselves, we started looking at the city and saying, where are people? Well, one of the places was there were these trains where people were commuting to work every day on the train. Well, what does it look like to plant a church on the train? We did that. There's a public park where young kids play soccer. What does it look like to plant a church there? So it's entering into those different spaces. And then the next space that increasingly is becoming very critical that we take notice of is online. People are spending more and more time like this online, and the coronavirus has accelerated that. And so what does it look like to plant churches online? And we were asking that question, probably 12, 13 years ago. And we were going on to different spaces back then, but the internet has just completely evolved since then. And so it's not about me saying online churches are a great idea. I'm not sure they're a great idea. But the reality of the fact that people are spending more and more time there, and if you aren't where people are, then you're not obedient to the Great Commission. Go into all these ethne. And so are we going into those spaces where people are to make disciples, plant churches, multiply leaders, transform those ethne?
So let me try to summarize that. So we have the different ethne within a city, which makes cities extremely complicated, extremely complex, because there's so many interest groups, so many affinity groups, and you can have millions of different relational networks, which we're calling affinity groups at this time. And then you also have the physical, the space, which is the living space, the workspace, the third space, which is maybe space for play, space for interests. And then you have a fourth space, which is online, which isn't necessarily a physical space.
And another one where people learn, universities, schools, that kind of thing. So we talk about 5 spaces.
5 spaces.
Where people live, work, play, learn, or surf online.
Okay.
Okay. And so, if once you got an affinity and you say, this is the group of people, you have to ask, where are they?
Where are they?
Where are they? And obviously they're in all those spaces, but where are the primary definitions for that affinity? And that's where we need to move towards.
So in a sense, it's both where we might be salt and light among what affinity groups, what ethne, and then it's about where physically we where we meet, where we disciple, and okay. I liked another idea statement that you made. It just stood out to me. You said movements are built around volunteers. Do you recall that statement?
I don't, but I think it's true.
Well, you were talking about the leadership and things that are there as we are discipling within an ethne, that for them to move along, to move, for the gospel to move, for discipleship to move, that the leadership within such a movement is primarily voluntary, and it's not like a role or a paid job per se.
Yeah. It's Acts 4. I think it's Acts 4:31. They looked at Peter and John and were amazed that they were unschooled and ordinary people that had been with Jesus. This is the core of how movements are built, with unschooled and ordinary people who have been with Jesus. And so, here's the thing. Let's look at it from a strategic, that's a quick biblical kind of overview. But if you look at it from a strategic point of view, You've got thousands and thousands, if not millions, of affinities all across the city. You've got all these different spaces, and they're not clearly defined. They cross over. It's a complete complex mess. And you go, how am I ever going to make any difference in that? You would be an absolute schizophrenic if you were going to do that as an individual. You'd be dressing and changing yourself and talking a certain way in one group, and then you'd have to change completely to try and pretend to be something else in a different group. And this is traditional missions. Again, was built on the idea that we want to reach a particular group of people. It was a large group of people that all spoke the same language, all the same ethnicity. So we're going to reach them. So we're going to go over, we're going to spend 10 or 15 years trying to become one of them, learn the language, learn the culture, become one of them, and then reach them. That breaks down completely in the urban environment. And so you've got all this complexity. How are we ever going to reach them? Well, the good news is we have an army. We have an army of ordinary people that just need to be mobilized. And here's the other good news about it. That army is made up of people from those different groupings and affinities. And so there's two ways you can go about it. We went about it initially by trying to understand the city. So I literally got all of the police, and we got in a helicopter, and I flew over the city, and I mapped it, and I got all the maps from the council. And the more I looked at it, the more paralyzingly complex it became. It just completely is overwhelming. And I got more and more depressed about it. And the one day I was sitting and just, having a good complaining session with God. I don't know if you ever do that, but I do that often. And I was just going, God, this is not possible. You've given me this heart to reach cities, but it's not possible. And a couple of things I kind of realized. One was, Henry Blackaby said, God is already at work. And it's our job to find out where he's at work and work with him. The other thing that really kind of struck me at the time is that we've begun to pay lip service to the priesthood of every believer. Largely, the church has continued to say it and has completely stopped practicing it. And so we've lost faith in the ordinary person. And this, Scripture says we have this incredible treasure in jars of clay. Well, now what we want is this incredible treasure in this beautiful jar so that everybody can sit and sort of watch that jar perform. I say to people, no army in their right mind sits on the banks at battle and sends their general in to fight the war. But the church does. And so what would it look like for the generals, instead of the generals out there trying to fight the battle, for the generals to mobilize the army? And so if we begin to do that, we begin to realize that God is already at work raising up people for all that complexity. He's already doing it. There are already people that he's raising up to say, I want to reach young people. I want to reach old people. I want to reach this ethnicity. I want to reach that language. He's raising up all those people. What do they lack? They're sheep without a shepherd. They lack leadership. They lack training. They lack mobilization. They lack a strategy. And so if we can begin to understand that, then as a city urban strategist, my main job is to see where God is at work, find those people, and raise them up to reach the people that he's called them to reach. And so we began to build a track around that. And, we have it now. We're moving online next year, and we have a 2-year track to raise up teams and help them do that. But you don't have to pull out the charts and have this complex computer program and be this genius to figure out the city, because by the time you've figured it out, it's all changed. I guarantee you. How do you reach that complexity? You've got to go back and realize that the author of the Great Commission is already at work. He's already raising up people far from God, close to God, in the churches, outside the churches, business people, ordinary people. My youngest disciple maker was 8 years old, started 3 groups. My oldest disciple was a 95-year-old illiterate woman. Every single ordinary person needs to be mobilized. if we want to reach the cities with the complexity. So again, this is something the church gives lip service to, but it has absolutely zero strategy to do it. And so our process begins by helping identify those people. We call those people that are called to an affinity, we call them a champion. We raise up those champions, we help them focus and clarify on what God's called them to do, and then we begin to help them build a team towards actually accomplishing what they're doing. And so what we're seeing in cities is hundreds of these little teams forming into all these affinities and beginning to multiply, because God is already doing it. We actually can't take credit for it. He's already doing it. But you don't even get to the importance of that strategy until you realize how paralyzingly complex the problem really is.
So the idea of a team of, let's say a team of 2 or 3 families are in a city, and they feel a stirring of God to reach the city, and they come to you and say, Dave, what are the first things we need to think through? Help us put some feet to this urge to reach the city that we have in our hearts. We don't know what to do with it. What would be your counsel to them? What process would you take them through?
Well, again, the city changes us. So the moment we move into a city, we become like the city. And the city creates 3 huge problems for people. A lack of purpose. And so as you move around the city, you begin to find that people are they're falling in with a system, but they'll say to you, I'm lacking purpose. I don't know what is my life all about? What is my life for? And so we want to help them restore that. They don't know how to manage their time and resources. And so one of the huge problems in cities is stress, overwhelm, time management. It's a big, big issue. And thirdly, they're battling with significant relationships in their life. And so we're seeing relational breakdown, divorce, people can't relate to their children. So these are 3 common issues that we find in cities. And so we start there with that team because they have the same problem. And so we would begin normally with a group of people like that. And we'd say, right, let's start with, the first module we normally would do would be focus. And we take them through about 6 to 8 weeks of intense coaching and mentoring to help them find laser focus. Because we find that, again, people have this dream, but they're dabbling in 100 different things, and they have absolutely no focus. And a vision without a strategy is just a dream. And so we want to get them to actually, how are you going to fulfill that vision? And focus is one of the big things. Jesus speaks about it in John 15. He says, even the fruitful trees, I'm going to come and prune and cut so they can be more fruitful. The idea of pruning away the useless stuff so that I can focus on the thing that God's called me to. Many of those teams can't even verbalize what God's called them to. And so we work on a calling statement. We get that very, very clear. Because of the complexity of the city, we're overwhelmed. And so we get down to, what is that affinity? Where do they dwell? Where is the focus? Where should you be spending your time if you want to see success? So that's the first thing we have to nail with that group of people. The next thing we would have to work with them with is, what do they then do on a weekly basis to get to that? And there's some of that is the principle of pruning, John 15. There's some of that is just basic time management. And there's some of that is just integration of sacred and secular in our own lives. Because we live such a dualistic life. We do our religious activity, and then we go and do our ordinary activity. And it's coming down to, listen, this is one integrated whole. But the stress of trying to live in compartments is what kills a lot of people. So we really help them to do that. And then we move towards team alignment, getting the team aligned. So those are fundamentals. If you don't get those fundamentals in place, what happens is you start talking about, let's go make disciples. You get great stories, you get great things happening, and a year later, it's all gone. It's like, I don't know if you grew up with candy floss, but, we had these big candy floss, and you bite into it, and it just kind of withers, and there's nothing left. And we saw that over and over in cities. We get people so excited about reaching the people out there that we forget that the people that we're working with are just as broken. And so part of it has to begin with them, and part of it has to begin with how do we replicate that out there. But it has to begin with them, because you can teach what you know, and this is a huge problem in movement circles, and I'm a movement proponent, but I will be the first to confess that right now around the world, one of the biggest problems we face in movements is that people going around, they get knowledge, they repeat knowledge, but that knowledge is not deeply founded in practice. And so we can teach what we know, but we can only reproduce who we are. And so if it doesn't fundamentally change you, you can't reproduce it. You will not see movement. And so we begin there with them. We actually go internal before we go out external. Now, pretty soon we'll go outward. But by the time we go outward and we show them how to make disciples, two things have happened. They know exactly where, they have a focus. And secondly, when they go, they're not reproducing knowledge, they're reproducing a lifestyle. They're reproducing what they already are and what they already live. That's a lot easier than memorizing an evangelism presentation. To share with someone, this is who I am, this is how I live, this is what I do, is a lot easier than a memorized, packaged gospel, which I don't believe largely works for effective evangelism.
Well, thank you very much. That's a lot to unpack, and I hope in the future I can have you back and we can kind of squeeze some more wisdom from you, David. Greatly appreciate your insight. I think it will help a lot of people, I'm going to say shorten their learning curve if they can focus on some of these things. And is there a website that people can go to hear more?
They can get hold of me on I have my own site, davidbroodryk.org, davidbroodryk.org. Okay. And you can even email me there directly, and it comes straight to my inbox. So I can't guarantee I'll respond quickly, but you can get a hold of me there.
Okay. Well, that's perfect. And so thank you very much, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, David.
Blessings.